Hey team, we're going to build a mapping app to track Santa, including Next.js for our React framework, React Leaflet to build a custom map, with an easy way to start using the Next.js Leaflet Starter, coming together to build our Santa tracking app so we can keep an eye on Jolly Saint Nick throughout Christmas Eve. I'm Colby Fayok, and if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and click that little notification bell for more web dev content. So diving in, we want to create this map where we have a list of all the destinations that Santa is going to arrive at throughout Christmas Eve and the early mornings of Christmas. Each of these locations are a destination, including the location itself, the arrival time, and the departure time. So we're going to create a new mapping app using Next.js Leaflet Starter. We're going to add markers for all the different destinations on the map. We're going to customize those icons, and we're going to customize them in a way where we can actually see where he's visited, as well as where he actually is at that moment. If you want to follow along, you can find the link to Next.js Leaflet Starter inside of the description of this video, but I'm going to scroll down here until I can find this quick start command where I'm going to copy this yarn create next app command, or alternatively you can use npm run. And in my terminal, I'm going to paste that right in, and I'm going to also tack on my Santa tracking app so it knows what directory to actually create it in and name my project. And what's going to happen is in the background, Yarn is going to go through, or Next.js rather, is going to go through, install all the dependencies, is going to refresh history, and clone down that example project so we have a great starting point. And once it's done, we can now navigate into that directory. And once inside, we can now run the command yarn dev, which is going to spin up a new development server for us, where we can now open that localhost 3000 link, where we can see once the page loads, we have a brand new mapping app where we're now centered on Washington, DC, which is just the general default center that we have inside of the application. But we can see that now we have a fresh start for our new mapping app. Looking at the code a little bit, we can navigate into source, pages, index.js, which is really going to be where we're going to be working out of today, where we can see that if we scroll down, we see our map component, which is abstracted already, which gives us some features, including be able to set our tile layer, which is the background of the mapping app, where you can actually see the geography, and then the marker, which is going to give us that display, where we already do see that default center, along with some of the other settings for how that's actually working. Now, we don't need to dive in too much into the map itself, but if we go to components and then we go to map, we can see that the way that this is working is we're actually loading in a dynamic map. And what I mean by that is if we start to look inside the files that are creating that module, we're using the Next.js dynamic because Leaflet and React Leaflet rely on the window, which isn't going to work on SSR or if you're generating the files. So we load that in dynamically, so once it's in the client, we can actually load that map from React Leaflet and everything else that we need to do to make it work. But diving in too deep into that is a bit out of scope for this video, so we're going to just get started, where the first thing we want to do is we want the data that shows us where all those locations are that Santa's actually going to be. To make this work, we're going to use this endpoint that the Google team created a while back for their own tracking app that just gives a list of all those locations. We're going to be able to see that it gives the city and region, as well as the location in a latitude and longitude, which we'll need for our mapping app, as well as things like the arrival time, the departure time, so we can actually see where Santa is at what specific time. Now, I don't expect you to try to type out this URL from seeing it in the video here, so I'll include it in the description so that you have an easy way to copy this endpoint right into your app. Now to fetch this data, well, we can technically just use the fetch API. Let's use SWR, which is just a nice way to be able to handle making the request to that endpoint, as well as being able to have that data easily available so we don't have to worry about things like caching, or we don't have to worry about things like actually managing the state to get that data. To get started, we're going to run yarn add SWR. So I'll copy that right into my terminal. And to actually use the code, we're going to use the quick start here where we can start copying and pasting things in, but ultimately we're going to want to import use SWR from SWR, which is a React hook. But what it's going to do is allow us to pass in the endpoint as well as a fetcher method or a function, which is going to give us basically a way to customize how we actually make that request, where this one is really just using the simple fetch API, but we can also see that we're going to be able to load our data and any kind of errors, and even if it is loading during that time. So I'm going to get started by copying the import statement, and at the top of index.js, I'm going to paste in the use SWR import. I'm going to also copy this fetcher and paste that in above my home page component. And finally, I'm going to actually grab that instance of use SWR and paste that inside of the React component for the home page, where we can now see that currently it's trying to make a request to API user /123. So what we want to actually do is update that to our new endpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that URL and just paste that right in. And then what I'm going to also do is add a console log for that data right afterwards And if we load the app and we start to look inside of the console, we can see that data come out where we have all those destinations in that same data format that we saw before, where we can scroll through and we can see all of that right inside of our console, which is exactly what we're going to use for the app. So back inside of our application, we're going to scroll down until we get to our map, where specifically we're going to look for the marker. And what we're going to do is we're going to dynamically create all the instances of a marker inside of a map statement. So I'm going to start off by writing data. I'm going to use an optional chaining of destinations, just in case that data doesn't exist yet, which when the app starts, it doesn't until it loads in the client. And I'm going to say map. And I'm going to say for each destination, I'm going to now create a new function where I'm going to ultimately return a component, and I'm going to return this marker component. So I'm going to paste that right in there above. I'm going to format this a little bit, but what I'm going to do now is try to break down this destination to actually pass in the data to all these marker instances. So let's start breaking this down, where instead of passing in destination for the entire thing, I'm going to start destructuring that. I'm going to say my ID, and we all know that we need to add a key to each marker instance so we keep React happy. But then we're going to grab the location, and instead of a default center, we're going to say that we want an array, and that's going to include location.lat and location.lng for longitude. And finally, instead of a pretty CSS3 pop-up, let's say that we want to add the city here. So we're going to say we want to also destructure the city and the region. And I'm going to simply print that out for city, comma, and our region. Now, if we look back at our page, this looks pretty similar to what we saw before. What's going on? Well, if we start to zoom out by clicking the little zoom icon, or if we use our touchpad or whatever to scroll out, we're going to start to see that we have a lot more pins there. The issue is by default, the map is zooming in on Washington, DC, and it's zooming in really far in the map. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're zooming in far out to see the entire world, and that it's actually centered in the middle of the world. Now inside the code, we can do that by finding the map component, where if we scroll to see all those props, we're going to see a center where we have that default center again, which let's just replace with the 0, 0, which is just going to be the center of the world. And then let's make the zoom 1, which is going to be really far out. Now, if we look back at the application and we reload the page, we can see all those markers on that first load because now we have a bigger look at the world. And one thing to note, if you're used to the hot reloading, you do got to actually reload the page between changes to the map because it relies on the window. So that state is still set when it's updating the window itself. But along with all these other markers, if we click on each and every one of them, we can now see the location of those markers as we click around through the different locations. But we have more interesting things than just the location name. We also have that arrival and departure time. So let's add that to the pop-up. So in addition to everything that we're already destructuring, we can also get the arrival and departure times, where these are going to come in the actual timestamps. So we want to make sure that we can actually make them human readable. So I'm going to start off by saying constant arrival date, and I'm going to set that equal to new date and pass in that arrival. And just to note, we're going to do pretty much the same exact thing for departure, but we'll do that after arrival so we don't have to do the same logic again. We can kind of just copy and paste it and change arrival to departure, and we'll be good to go. But we also want to get constant arrival hours, constant arrival minutes, and we can do that by using functions or methods that are on this date object. So I'm going to say for my arrival date, I'm going to add get hours, and then for my minutes, I'm going to do the same thing for get minutes. Now finally, I'm going to say constant arrival time. We're going to put that together where I'm going to say arrival hours, I'm going to put in a colon, and then I'm going to say arrival minutes, if I spell that correctly. And like I said, we can just simply clone this because it's going to be the same thing for our departure, and we can use multi-select or really whatever you want to do to make this easier for yourself to go through, where we can change all those instances of arrival to departure. So now the only thing left to do is actually add it to the pop-up. So I'm going to just add some breaking points here. Let's say arrival, and we'll set this to, I don't need the $, arrival time. Then another breaking point, and let's say departure for departure time. And after I fix my typo quickly to make sure I have the casing right, we can now see that if we click on our locations, we have that arrival and departure. But the timestamp, we probably want to know the actual date of that as well, right? So for each of these, I'm going to say that I want to add my arrival date to date string, And then let's throw an @ sign in between there. So it says date at that time. And then let's copy this like we normally do, but for departure, I'm going to say departure date. And if we load things back up and try to click on again one of our locations, we now see the date that Santa is actually going to visit, whether that's December 24th or December 25th, depending on where you are at in the world. Now, if you have a good eye, you might actually be able to see that this actually says 2019. It looks like this data hasn't actually been updated in the last few years, but it's still working, so it's still usable. But what we need to do is we need to go through and correct this data and make sure that it's actually being represented for 2022 instead of 2019. So to do this, we're going to head back up to the top of our component file, where what we're going to do is we're going to create a new constant of destinations, and we're going to set that equal to data, again with the optional chaining, destinations as well, where we'll create this new constant and use that instead. But we're going to map through each and every one of these destinations, and for each destination, we'll run a function where by default, we're going to return an object where I'm going to spread out all the existing data for that destination. Now, what I want to ultimately do is modify the arrival and departure. So I'm going to first destructure that arrival and departure from the destination. And I'm going to wrap each and every one of those as constant arrival date with new date for arrival. I'm going to do the same exact thing for departure to make sure that I have the same thing for each. And then for each of these, I'm going to say that I want to run set full year, where I want to specify the year that I'm actually creating this for. And right now I'm creating this for 2022. And technically we could probably just do that and be done with it, but we want to make sure that this is able to update every year, right? We don't want this just for 2022. We want it to work in 2023. So what we can do is instead, we're going to create a new constant, and we're going to call that current date. Let me fix constant there. And we're going to say that's equal to new date. And inside of date, we're going to pass in date.now. Now with that, I can create a new constant called current year and set that equal to current date.get full year. And what we'll end up doing is we'll pass in that current year to each of those instances of the date. And then finally, we're going to create new keys for arrival and our departure. And we're going to transform these back into the timestamps that we're expecting below. So I'm going to say get time for that arrival, and for the departure date, I'm going to do the same thing with get time. Now the only thing left to do is update the data that we're mapping to destinations. So I'm going to grab that and I'm going to head down to where we actually have our map and change this to data. Instead of data, I'm going to make it destinations. I'm going to still add the optional chaining to make sure that it is actually defined before we start to map through it. Now it looks like I did forget that R in departure again, but after I fix that, we can now start to click on our marker locations, and we do now see 2022, which is perfect. Now this is working pretty great, but this is a little bland. Let's add some holiday cheer to this. I created these icons using emojis where I just have a Christmas tree that we can use to customize our actual map marker. So you can find a link to these inside of the description, or you can head to the demo repo where inside of public images, you'll be able to find that icon as well as some other icons that we'll be using. But I know it's going to be a little hard to see here because of the zoom, but we ultimately want to drop this into the public images directory where we'll have both of those tree icons available as public assets. Now heading back to the code, what we're going to end up doing is we're going to add a new prop to marker called icon. So the first thing I'm going to do is break this down so that it's a little bit easier to read as the props are starting to get a little bit long, but we're going to be creating this icon prop. Now, in order to create a leaflet icon, we need to use the leaflet library. If we scroll up a little bit into our map where we have our render props, what we want to do is add an additional argument of leaflet, and that's going to be outside of the actual object that we're grabbing those components from. But we're going to take leaflet and we're going to go back to that icon prop, and we're going to specify leaflet.icon, where that's going to be a function we're going to invoke that we're going to pass in our configuration object for this icon. Now we're going to have three properties we're going to want to set: icon URL, icon retina URL, and also our icon size. Now, because we just dropped those images inside of public images, we have those available at /images. So I'm going to say for my icon URL, it's going to be /images/tree marker icon.png. And similarly, we're going to do that for the retina URL, except this time it's going to be our @2times image. Now finally, we want to add the icon size, and that icon size is going to be the size of the smaller icon, because the @2times images is going to be purposefully bigger or double that size so that we can add it nice and retina for the displays that actually support that. But for this one, because the icon is 41 by 41, I'm going to specify an array of 41, 41. And as soon as we open the app, we can now see that we have all those Christmas trees, replacing those boring old map markers that we had before. Now let's take this a step further. While these Christmas trees look nice, it doesn't really give us a lot of help for actually trying to track Santa, where we would have to manually go through every single one of these in order to find out what time that Santa is actually visiting. So instead, we can use custom leaflet icons to show where Santa's at. We can also show where he's been. So instead of a Christmas tree, if he's already been there, we can show an icon of a gift. But if Santa is there, we can show the emoji for Santa. So just like the tree icon, I have these already available for you in the same public images directory where we have our gift icon and our Santa icons, where once we have our gift and our Santa icons inside of our directory, we could start to define the logic that's going to update each and every one of these URLs for the different state. So let's start off by creating two new constants, Santa was here and constant Santa is here, where these are going to be where we're going to compare the times to determine if he was or is here. Now to check if Santa was here, we're going to compare against the departure date. So we're going to say current date get time, and we're going to subtract that departure date dot get time. And we're going to say, is that greater than 0, which we're basically saying, is it after the departure date? Now we're going to do a similar thing for the is here, but this time we're going to use the arrival date. And we're going to say, is it after, are we currently after the arrival date? The only issue is there's going to be a lot of locations that are after the arrival date. So what we also want to do is tack on and if Santa was not here. So we're basically saying if it's past the arrival date and he still hasn't left. But now with that, we can start to define the logic that's going to replace our URL. So starting off, we're going to create two let variables where we have our icon URL and we have our retina icon URL. And we're going to use those tree icons as the default images. But now, because we have the Santa was here and Santa is here, we can use those to set dynamically the different URLs. So we're going to say if Santa was here, we're going to change icon URL and our icon retina URL to instead use one of the different URLs that we have. And particularly, we're going to use, for if Santa was here, we're going to use the gift URL. And we can do the same thing for if Santa is here, where we're going to say instead of the gift, we're going to say Santa, the Santa icon. So now, once we have these variables all set, we can start to replace that inside of the configuration object so that we're passing those variables right through. But if we look up the map, we notice that we still see all of those same Christmas trees. We don't see the gift and the Santa icon. And that's because, well, it's not Christmas Eve yet. So what we can do is we can fake the time so that we can see where it would be in any particular time that we set. If we go back up to the top of our code, we can find our current date, which I'm going to duplicate, and I'm going to comment out one of them. But inside of new date, I'm going to cheat and I'm going to actually paste in a timestamp where I'm passing in December 25th at 2:34 and 30 seconds inside of the UTZ time zone. And once our app reloads, we can see that we now have a bunch of gifts for where Santa has already been. If you're more familiar with the East Coast, it's probably about 9:30 on the East Coast. So it kind of makes sense if he's still inside of South America, kind of going around. But if we scroll down, or zoom in, we can see Santa is indeed there, and he's being sneaky behind a Christmas tree. Now, let's fix that issue as well before we move on, where we want to make sure that Santa is at the top of all the icons so that we can easily track him. Now back to our leaflet icon configuration, we can now pass in a class name variable. And let's create that where we can say let class name, and let's just set that equal to an empty string because we don't have a default class name that we're using. But we're going to say if Santa is here, we're going to set a new class name where let's include the existing, just in case we do set one later down the line. But I'm going to say I want to import styles icon Santa is here, and we're importing styles because we're currently using CSS modules, or particularly we're using Sass modules, but we're going to import that class name, which we'll add in a second here. Now we can see that we're passing that class name straight into that configuration. But now if we go to source styles and we open up home.module.scss, let's head to the bottom. Let's add icon Santa is here for our class name. And let's say z index, let's make that 999. Let's do 4 nines. Now, if we look inside of the browser, we can see that it's actually not working. And if we look at the image itself, it's because it's getting a z-index set right on the element itself. So if we scroll down, we'll eventually be able to see where we're setting that z-index, but it's not working. So that means we got to set the dreaded important flag on that style. So after my 9999, I'm going to pass on the important flag. And we can see Santa immediately pop up where now he's nice and visible. So we can very easily see that now if we click on that, we can see that Santa is in Buenos Aires, Argentina, who won the World Cup. Now we're going to stop there, but before you go, we have one really important thing we need to make sure that we do, and that's head back inside of our code. And if we're done with our application, we need to make sure that we uncomment the date now, because we don't want to have a mishap when we're actually trying to track Santa on Christmas Eve. We want to make sure that we are using the correct date. But there's still a lot more that you can do if you want to continue on with this project. Since we are getting that current date as soon as the function loads, we are going to have that as a static value, meaning it's only going to show at that point in time, so it's not going to keep updating. But what you can do is you can use something like set interval, where you can have a function fire store this date inside of a state object, where you can make sure that that's updating, say, every 30 seconds, so that you can see real time every time Santa moves to a new location. Now another thing, we'll notice that when I set that static current date, I actually use 3430 instead of something like, say, 350. And the reason I did that is if we look at the map now, we actually don't see Santa anywhere at all. And that's because he's between locations. So what we can do is we can find that last stop and we can find the next stop, figure out the midpoint, and then show Santa on the map exactly where that location is. And if that sounds like something really complex to do all that math to figure out the midpoint between two locations, don't worry, we can use a library for that, where if we check out turf.js, we find this midpoint function where we can pass in 2 coordinates and it'll find the center of that. So we can easily do that and put Santa wherever he is on that map. How about theming this application? While we have some really nice icons that show the Christmas spirit, we can do a lot more, such as the background, the title. There's a lot to have here. We're actually trying to create a nice Christmas theme or holiday theme when you're trying to build this tracker application. So customize it. You can even add a background using Mapbox, where if you want to learn how to do that and customize your background for a different custom imagery, such as using Mapbox, you can check out this video that I have where it's for Gatsby, but the same concept still should apply. Mapping applications have some really huge potential for being able to do things to help the community and potentially save lives, but they also have some deeply critical, important things like tracking Santa on Christmas Eve. What's your favorite use case for using maps in your applications? Let me know in the comments. If you want to build and learn more things in Next.js, such as maybe you want to add live chat to your tracking app so you can track it along with family and friends real time, check out my video adding live chat to a Next.js app where you can even sync message replay using Stream. Or if you want to use images inside of your Next.js application, but you want to make sure that you're using high performance, check out my video Optimize Images, Responsive Sizing, and AI Cropping in Next.js with Nextcloudinary. If you like this video, make sure you hit thumbs up, subscribe, and click that little notification bell for more web dev content. Happy holidays and thanks for watching.